Meanwhile, you know, the left seems to be so good at the grand gesture, right? The grand gesture rather than the hard, practical stuff that just takes time and sweat. Now, a year and a half ago, the Albanese government promised a new package to help women. Now, the key measure in that was something that Indigenous Australians Minister Linda Burney had promised since 2021, 500 new community sector workers to support women in crisis, victims of domestic violence, half of them in the country so Aboriginal women could get help too. Linda Burney's press release scathing. She said Liberal governments hadn't taken this seriously. It was past time. Really. Joining me is Liberal Senator Kerrynne Liddle. Senator Liddle, you've wondered where those 500 community workers are that Labor has promised for so long. This is an issue, of course, that you've been passionate about for years. How many of those workers have you traced?
Well, when I was visiting the sector, they were telling me they didn't know much about those workers that were promised back almost 2 years ago, an election promise, and they were in the budget in 2022. I couldn't get an answer from the minister through the parliamentary process, so I then wrote to the state and territory ministers asking them for an update. I got very little. That's because there was very little to tell. We found out in Senate estimates only last week that the number is actually 2. 2 out of 500. That's appalling. 2.
So they've had nearly 2 years of a promise they first made 4 years ago, nearly, or 3, and of the 500, just 2. How can that be explained?
Well, it can't be explained other than this. They're just not fit for government. They're not fit to deliver in this area. We've had an epidemic of domestic and family violence right across the country. We've even seen an increase in their time in government, and yet still they're on a go slow in delivering critical outcomes to women, children and vulnerable people. Quite simply, it's just not good enough. I don't know how you can argue that 2 out of 500 when we've seen increases of some 20% of domestic violence cases that are reported. Let's not forget there are many that go unreported in the Northern Territory. We didn't even hear of a prioritising of those states and territories where the issues are significant. Northern Territory, Western Australia and Tasmania. Quite frankly, all the relevant ministers in this area, I think, are missing in action.
Kerrynne Liddle, could one explanation be, you saw how preoccupied, how much time the Indigenous Australians Minister Linda Burney, whose baby this is, spent on The Voice, the purely symbolic racist division of Australia. She spent, I don't know, a year and a half on that? Could it be that she was simply distracted by the purely symbolic rather than do something practical and much needed?
Well, you know, the catchphrase now that you hear a lot is lived experience, listening to lived experience. And during that period, we had listening to the voices. But it seems this Labor government, the Albanese government, is all about listening to the voices it wants to hear and listening to the experience that it has. Because when you go to these communities that are impacted and you talk to the sector workers, they're desperate. They needed these workers yesterday. And the Prime Minister himself back in November, you know, I was flabbergasted to hear him say that he's delivered the community service worker commitment. He even said his government was taking immediate and practical action. You know, I don't see anything immediate, practical or delivered when you've only put 2 out of 500 workers into the workforce when we've got an epidemic and people are screaming out in the sector for help, let alone the people who are affected by violence screaming out for help too. It's just not good enough.
I think that's what she said in a press statement 3 years ago, saying she was going to take immediate action. Senator Kerrynne Liddle, thank you so much indeed for your time.